If Kansas is going to win this game, and it's not going to be easy, it's going to need to be a pretty clean game. And I mean that from a turnover standpoint. I mean that from a not really making big mistakes standpoint. And I also just mean from a do your job and don't worry what the guy next to you is doing type of standpoint. If they got guys out there trying to play hero ball, it's probably not going to work. And that's the thing that's frustrating about playing Kansas State first under Bill Snyder and now under Chris Kleiman is Kansas State does not beat itself. It just doesn't. That's why the BYU game was so fluky, was Kansas State did kind of beat itself with some really fluky plays in that one. But generally speaking, if you beat K-State, it's because you have to beat K-State.
Thanks for listening to KC Sports Network, proudly presented by Emprise Bank. If you're thinking about starting a business or know someone who is, check out Emprise Bank's SBA loans. It's always good to know your options, and they can be your partner in possible. Paid all who enter. Beware this podcast. That's right, this is a paid podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer. I'm here with Kevin Flaherty. We're brought to you by Emprise Bank, your partner in all things possible, member FDIC. And if you're watching on YouTube, maybe wondering, what is Purple doing on the show? Trust me, it's for a good cause. KU's playing K-State this weekend. It's the Sunflower Showdown. So we had decided to invite our friend from the other side of the rivalry at 24/7 Sports with GoPowercat, Ryan Wallace, to the show. Ryan, how are you doing?
Take it easy on me today, guys. Okay, that's all I ask. Go easy.
We'll try not to be too harsh on you, but yeah, it is the Sunflower Showdown coming up on Saturday. This was a game that, in many respects, in the preseason, I think people were expecting it to be sort of one of the best showdowns between these two schools in maybe the last 20 years. Truly, with some of the expectations that KU had, K-State, of course, always being a team that expects to be at or near the top of the Big 12. One of those teams has fulfilled their obligations to this point of the season. The other, not so much. KU comes in at 2-5. K-State at 6-1 with their one loss against BYU. Kansas, though, is coming off their best game of the season, I would say, to this point, against Houston. So, even though the records are off from maybe what the expectations were, I think this potentially could still end up being a game that maybe lives up to the preseason expectations in some ways. But overall, we'll start with you, Kevin. How are you feeling coming into this game? KU had a bye week. They get a win against Houston at home. Now they're going to Manhattan. What's your temperature level right now heading into this game?
Well, I just couldn't believe Ryan said before we came on that Kansas was going to blow K-State out. Well, in all seriousness, I think it is a game that I think all three of us kind of circled before the season started as a potential college game day destination, right? When you looked at the schedules matching up and the way that you kind of felt like Kansas would be able to build momentum through the start of the season. Like you said, K-State has done what it's supposed to do. It had kind of a little bit of a weird game, I would say, against BYU. It was, to be quite frank, a little bit of a fluky loss when you look at some of the things that happened. And other than that, Kansas State has been really, really good. Kansas, even with 30 seniors, it took them a little while. And I thought we got a chance to talk to Lance Leipold this week, to Jeff Grimes this week. Both of them kind of talked about Jalen Daniels finding a comfort level about the fact that Kansas's offense has been able to kind of ratchet down the turnovers, and the offense is starting to kind of get to where I think we thought it might get. Kansas is averaging 6.5 yards per play in Big 12 play. That's second in the conference, Ryan, to Kansas State. And so when you look at this game, I think both teams have defenses that can get stops. I think Kansas State's defense obviously coming in on a higher note than Kansas is, but I also think there's the potential here for both offenses to be able to move the ball.
Ryan, I am curious from your perspective on this game. Kansas State comes into this game off of two pretty tough road trips into two different time zones, and now they come back home to play against Kansas. I mean, is there any potential that maybe K-State might be a little bit of a tired team maybe coming into this game, or do you get the sense that they're still focused, even though KU maybe hasn't been as what people on the KU side hope they would be up to this point?
Yeah, that's interesting that you bring that up, because I think it got brought up in Avery Johnson's press conference this week, and he kind of laughed about it because Coach Tremaine Carroll, who's the strength and conditioning coordinator at K-State, Avery had mentioned the same thing to them that morning, the morning of the press conference, kind of saying like, I know you guys are tired because I'm tired. Like they just need rest at this point. The physical, wear and tear on your body at this point of the season for any team is going to catch up. But then, like you said, Nick, to be going to all these different time zones, I mean, welcome to life in the new Big 12. You can't make excuses for it. It is what it is. But getting back to that first part, Kevin, I'm kind of with you because like entering the season, I thought that this is maybe how we would be going into this game. Maybe not record-wise, in terms of where KU is at, where K-State's at, but just in terms of kind of how the teams have progressed and developed, although I thought the roles would be flipped. I figured that this would be Kansas riding high into Manhattan, like Nick said at the top of the show, kind of living up to those preseason expectations, and that K-State was going to be the team that needed some time to kind of get the engine going with Avery Johnson's first true year and a new offensive line for the most part, breaking in some new starters and the new coordinators and having some young inexperience on offense. I figured they would kind of need the defense to get them to this point. And maybe by now they'd be ready to take on a Kansas team. And instead it's kind of the opposite. As you guys mentioned, K-State has kind of lived up to the billing so far. And yet at the same time, I think KU might be hitting their stride here. And it's not just because they played Houston. I think you can take little bits and pieces from the last several weeks with KU and say, yeah, if they, I know as a KU fan, it's got to be like making you pull your hair out because you're one or two pieces away, right? But I'm a firm believer in what Kenny Dillingham said before he played KU down there in Tempe of like, this is a couple breaks away from being what at that point, a 3-1 team, something like that, 4-1. So it's just been interesting, Nick, like the way that things have kind of flipped. And yet at the same time, you could throw the records out and look at both of these teams side by side and go, they're more comparable than you think.
Well, that's the fascinating thing to me is I kind of mentioned it with KU playing probably their best game of the season against Houston, which is a good thing. On the flip side, though, K-State probably played one of their best games of the season last week against West Virginia, too. So you got two teams that are playing at relatively high levels coming into this game, which I think is certainly what fans want to see coming into a game like this. And then you got Avery Johnson, who obviously has been outstanding, certainly the last couple of games, but maybe not in the way that people expected him to be preseason, right? It's been with his arm, and he's been fairly limited with an injury, mobility-wise. And, Kevin, that's where I kind of wonder heading into this game, like, we've talked about it. Kansas has struggled with mobile quarterbacks over the course of not just this season, but the season before, and even you can go back, under Coach Brian Borland. And so with Avery Johnson's potential mobility limited a little bit, possibly coming into this game, we'll see, I guess. I mean, where are you at on Avery Johnson in terms of what he can do in this game against Kansas compared to what Kansas maybe expected to face with him, earlier in the year?
I'm actually where Brian Borland was at today, and that's he said we would be really foolish to approach Avery Johnson like he's not going to run all over us, basically. Like there's not going to be designed run, like there's not going to be the potential for him to scramble. Just because he didn't run last game, and I think Ryan would agree with me on this, doesn't mean that he can't run. I think that in that game against Colorado, kind of got nicked up a little bit, had to go to the locker room. But against West Virginia, it wasn't necessarily, hey, this is really weird that Avery's not running. I'm not sure he needed to run. And when you looked at what Kansas State was doing to that West Virginia secondary, when you look at the success Avery was having throwing to those guys beating West Virginia's secondary, I really think that it's set up to where K-State didn't need Avery Johnson to run. They didn't need him to scramble. They didn't need him to do those things. And so I almost think it's that whole Star Wars thing of it's a trap. If you prepare this thing that you're going to be facing Avery Johnson and he's not going to run on you, you're opening yourself up to get hurt. And I think that needs to be sort of consideration number one is, hey, this is a guy that still can hurt us with his legs, because if you go in thinking you're facing Josh Hoover here, Hoover being a guy that mostly sticks in the pocket and throws the ball from the pocket, I think you're only opening yourself up to really get hurt.
Yeah, the oblique, whatever he tweaked out there in Boulder seems to be doing better, right? Because, Tim Fitzgerald over at GoPowercat was laughing because he said he asked after the pregame to West Virginia how Avery was feeling, and it was just, I'm good, and kind of left it at that, where you were like, well, are you good? And as Kevin said, clearly he wasn't 100% because you go back to PFF and they had Avery with 0 design rushing yards, but also 0 scrambling yards. And part of that was because the pocket was kept so clean. Credit to K-State's offensive line. But I mean, there were areas in that game where he probably could have taken off and maybe would have taken off at times. And you saw him not want to do that and know it probably wasn't smart. So if he is more healthy than he was last week, and by all accounts, he went a little bit more in depth this week about saying, I'm good. And, so I do think he's getting as close to 100 that he's been, and let's say better part of 6 quarters, something like that. That's a good sign. But also if he's 80%, guys, he has to be part of the game plan for Kansas State, and therefore part of the game plan for Brian Borland, like you mentioned, because to me, they would be crazy for they being Connor Riley and Matt Wells, the offensive coordinators for Kansas State, to not have Avery Johnson as a purposeful member of the game plan. If you look at his scramble yards to design rushing yards on PFF, design rushing yards, he really only has 229. And the biggest game that he had where it was clearly like by design was the Arizona game. He had 92 design rushing yards, 32 scrambling yards. So that was by far his best kind of rushing performance. And I think that's the type of game plan that if I'm K-State, I roll out against KU. Start on the ground, just like kind of we've seen from KU at times, right? Start it with Devin Neal and try and open up the pass that way. I would expect that will be what K-State wants to do. And then it will kind of be the chess match early on as to, can K-State win in that regard and force KU to try and adjust? Or does KU rise to the occasion and force K-State to try to adjust and kind of go back to the well, so to speak, and make Avery beat them with their arm, which a lot of folks have tried this season. And I don't know. He's been surprisingly balanced, I think, at both. Kevin and I saw Avery, Nick, in high school, and we knew, we knew that he was probably a better passer than people expected him to be. And even saying that, I think what he's been able to show in the pocket, just with his presence and feeling out pressure and delivering some of the deep ball stuff that we've seen, and it hasn't been much. K-State doesn't, go vertically near as much as Jalen Daniels and KU does, but he's proven to be a threat with his arm, and yet not had to resort so much to just beating teams with his legs. I do think moving forward, though, he might have to do that starting on Saturday night.
I think if you were KU and you could dream up like the worst nightmare of a quarterback to face, it would probably be Avery Johnson because of his running ability, as you outlined, Ryan. And yes, absolutely, I agree. Like, even though he hasn't been doing it much over the past couple of games with whatever injury he's been dealing with, certainly you have to prepare for that if you're KU. And one of the things we saw from KU against Houston was they started turning up the blitz a lot more than really we've probably ever seen them do under Brian Borland over the last 2.5 years. My question for you, Ryan, is that a viable strategy to stop Avery Johnson? If you're KU, are you sitting there saying, should we try to blitz this guy, put him under pressure and see if he can make a mistake? Or is that just going to make things possibly exacerbate an issue where if he gets escaped out of that, then you're in real trouble with his legs?
Yeah, I guess it's probably a twofold kind of question or answer. And one would kind of be throwing it back to you guys. But the first part of that would be, to me, I think it's got to be a blitz and like a blitz plus. I don't think going like, fire heat, scorch earth type of blitz package is probably the way to go. Because I just think it even if you get through, right, I think it still gives him rushing lanes. And that's what Avery's been so good at, kind of feeling players out or feeling defenses out and finding the seam even when he's under duress. And his speed is one of those things that you can watch on tape. And until you kind of see him in person and how fast he really is, I think folks can kind of be like, well, we've got him, and you don't. And then you're giving up. 5, 10, 20. And that gets me to the second part, which you guys could be able to answer is, let's say you do decide to bring a blitz and not have a plus, meaning like a spy or somebody at least kind of in that intermediate level to say, well, if he does get free, I can be here to, try and slow him down. If you don't do that, what kind of grade right now would you give the KU secondary in terms of open field tackling? Because that's what then you have to start to think about.
Yeah, I mean, I think from that perspective, like that's kind of where I was going with this, which is KU's biggest strength on defense has been their secondary. Kobe Bryant, obviously 3 interceptions, Melo Dotson, like they're opportunistic type players. I almost wonder if you're KU here, if you don't just say, we're going to trust those guys on their own to say, go cover these K-State receivers, and we're going to do our best to try to stop Avery Johnson. I do think Cordell Wheeler being healthier, I don't want to say fully healthy because I don't know if he is, but being healthier and probably going to be playing a significant portion of snaps is going to be significant for KU as well in this game. But yeah, I think if you're KU and you're facing off against a player like Avery Johnson, who is clearly playing at a high level, right, had probably his best basketball performance of the season against West Virginia, wasn't really pressured at all, was able to just, kind of pick apart West Virginia's defense. Like, your biggest strength is your secondary for KU. I think you need to lean into that and just say, we got to find a way to get this guy off his game. Let's blitz him. It worked out against Houston for the most part. Donovan Smith even was still able to scramble. And also, I think if you're Brian Boylan, you almost have to just accept the fact that Avery Johnson's probably going to get you for a couple long scrambles throughout the game. And just say, if that happens, it happens, but we're going to stick with this game plan.
And Kevin, real quick, let me jump in and then I want to hear your response. But sure. I think that's a smart move by Nick if you're KU, because then let's say, you just say, we're going to bring out heat right off the bat. And I think right away, it will give you kind of a barometer reading, so to speak, on, okay, how healthy is Avery? Like, does he just immediately take off, or is he, kind of guarded in how he runs? And to me, that could be really telling in one of the first, 1 or 2 possessions for KU of like, well, he looked like he didn't really want to run there, and then you can go, okay, he might not be 100%, or you go, yeah, he took off like 100% Avery. Maybe that's not the way we go moving forward, but I think Nick might be onto something there, just to kind of give it a test run the first couple touches for K-State.
Yeah, and Kansas hasn't really gotten burned when blitzing from a quarterback run standpoint. Where they've got hurt, I think Nick would agree with this, is when they've sent 4, not only have they not gotten home, but the quarterback's reading War and Peace in the pocket. And that just gives, guys time to kind of get out of rush lanes. I mean, if you've got 6 seconds, something is going to open up. And that's when the quarterback's been able to take off and hurt him. And so I like the idea of sending guys, of making him make decisions quickly. I think Nick's got a good point. In today's college football, I feel like it's more important to make a big play than it is detrimental to give up a big play. And by that, I mean, if you can take away somebody's possession, either by having a big negative play or a turnover or something of that nature, I think that's worth its weight in gold and worth more than, hey, we got beat on that play, we gave up a 50-yard touchdown. And so I think if it's me, I go in saying, maybe we want to be kind of a big play defense today where we may give up a couple shot plays, we may get hurt a couple times, but we also may get K-State off the field a few times because we're able to generate something negative. I think when KU has gone safer, when they've rushed 4, when they've just shown 4, they haven't shown extra guys and rushed 4, it hasn't gone well for them because they've still given up those big plays, even though they've been playing conservatively. I thought it was interesting. I kind of asked Moreland today about the pressure rate, and he said, well, it was something we saw with Houston that we felt like we could kind of get after them in certain situations and it would really hurt them. He didn't really indicate if that was going to be something they were really going to do a lot more moving forward. They were kind of varied in it, Ryan, though, to your point. Marvin Grant got a sack kind of coming off the edge. Jamie Brown's been their best pass rusher. They got a sack, I think, on him kind of with a full-on blitz. They also got a sack where Jamie Brown came on like a delayed blitz where it didn't look like he was coming, looked like he was going to spy, and then he took off and got in. And so they've been able to show some variation in what they've been able to do. But to me, even more dangerous than them sending guys and getting hurt for it is sending 4 and giving Avery all day back there to hurt them either with his legs or his arm.
I do want to dive more into this discussion about the offense of K-State because there is one player that we didn't bring up that I think also could break this game that I want to dive into. We're going to take a break real quick, then we'll get into that. As always, though, you can check out homefieldapparel.com for all your great KU gear. They've also got K-State gear. If you happen to be a K-State fan tuning in, they've got great K-State items as well. I'm rocking the Warhawk shirt here for KU. I also submitted my order. Kevin, get this. I'm going to get myself a Western Kentucky shirt because they've got the blob, the lovable red blob shirt. I got one of those coming. Youngstown State for my guy Dylan Woodkey. Ball State because chirp chirp, come on, as well. So there's tons of other schools you can get. I've got some shipped to me coming up here, so you'll probably be seeing me rocking those on the show as well. And if you want to buy, from KU or any of the other 120 plus schools at homefieldapparel.com, you can use the promo code PAY24, 15% off your first order at homefieldapparel.com. More Sunflower Showdown preview is coming up next. Looking for tickets for your next event? Tickets for Less is your number one source. Save big on every purchase when you use promo code KCSN at ticketsforless.com.
You know when you discover a new binge-worthy show or a song that you bump on repeat and you have to share it with your friends so they can experience just how awesome it is? That's kind of what it feels like when you discover Mint Mobile offers premium wireless for $15 a month when you purchase a 3-month plan. That's such an awesome deal, there's no way you can keep it to yourself. Friends don't let friends overpay for wireless. Say bye-bye to your overpriced wireless plan and switch to Mint Mobile. Mint Mobile is here to rescue you and your squad with premium wireless plans starting at $15 a month. All plans come with high-speed data and unlimited talk and text delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. Use your own phone with any Mint Mobile plan and bring your phone number along with all of your existing contacts. Ditch overpriced wireless with Mint Mobile's deal and get 3 months of premium wireless service for $15 a month. To get this new customer offer and your new 3-month premium wireless plan for just $15 a month, go to mintmobile.com/payheed. That's mintmobile.com/payheed. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/payheed. $45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details.
This is the Paid Podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer. I'm here with Kevin Flaherty. Special guest Ryan Wallace from K-State at GoPowercat 24 Sports is joining us to help preview the Sunflower Showdown between the Jayhawks and the Wildcats coming up on Saturday night in Manhattan. Guys, by the way, this is the third straight primetime kickoff of the Sunflower Showdown. Interestingly, third straight night game kickoff of the Sunflower Showdown, which is interesting to say the least. So I teased right before the break one player we hadn't actually mentioned yet about this K-State offense that I want to get into now, and that's DJ Giddens, right? I think everyone on the KU side, Devin Neal obviously is a phenomenal player. He only needs 72 yards, by the way, to set the all-time rushing record for Kansas, which he could easily get in this game against K-State, which would be an incredible feat for a guy from Kansas, a local guy. K-State's got a local guy of their own in DJ Giddens from Junction City, who has been maybe one of the best running backs in the country, as much as it hurts me to say that up to this point in the season, but he has been so good. Ryan, when you watch DJ Giddens, what is it about him you think this season that's allowed him to take that next step? And I mean, from the Kansas side, if you're trying to stop him, well, how do you even try to do that? I mean, West Virginia had success, but other than that, he's been able to just run over pretty much anybody that K-State has faced so far this season.
Well, I mean, to stop him, you've got to be physical at the line of scrimmage, and that's easy to say, right? K-State's offensive line has been up to the task. They've seemed to have gotten away from some of their kind of miscues and things that we saw earlier in the season, particularly Tulane. I thought was a really rough outing for them, but they've withstood the test and gotten better and better each week. So that's probably part one. And it used to be with DJ, I think even going back to last year, it was being physical and winning in the trenches, specifically, in the A and B gaps, right? He was a guy that was trying to get north and south right up the gut, and he's a physical guy. I mean, 6'1", well over 200 pounds. And so he's he was kind of thought to be a bruiser. Where he separated himself this year is we're seeing him get off tackle and make guys miss and kind of hit the accelerate button more than I certainly thought that he had last year. He's showing some wiggle to him and not being kind of as stiff as a runner as I felt like he appeared at times, in the earlier parts of his career. So I still think kind of his bread and butter is, churning over guys up the middle and then kind of breaking into daylight. And so, I know from talking to you guys that defensive tackle has been a strength of KU throughout this season in terms of one position on defense. If they can continue to do that, I think that's a great starting spot is, taking on a guy like Sam Hecht, who's the K-State center that's in his first season and has played really, really good for his first season, not really just as a starter, but as a real like significant snap guy on that offensive line. He's played really, really consistently. And yet still, he hasn't really been rattled a whole lot. And part of that's his credit. But you also wonder like how much they put an emphasis right on a guy like Sam Hecht, or, how healthy Hadley Panzer could be for this one. And, Taylor Potier, another Kansas guy, seeing if you can do some damage on the inside. And then, again, you've got a guy, as Kevin mentioned, in JB Brown that's been really good on the outside as a tackler and as a pass rusher. And then, kind of corralling DJ from that aspect. That's probably the way you go about it. But I think if KU can get some strong play out of their defensive tackles, that would be a great starting spot. Because to me, that's where DJ gets, his momentum from. And that's where they get him into a rhythm, starting kind of up the gut and then moving him more outside, where he has become a much, much better and more dynamic weapon in the open field.
Well, Kevin, we spent so much time talking about how KU should try to slow down Avery Johnson. I kind of get the sense that could all become a moot point, though, if they can't stop DJ Giddens or at least slow him down a little bit. I mean, to me, he is the guy that, from the defensive perspective, like he could just take over the game. Like whatever game plan KU may have defensively may not matter if they can't slow him down.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think that's a big part of why Cornell Wheeler is so important. You don't want another situation like Arizona State with Cam Scatterbo, right? Because that was sort of the one time that an opposing running back that another team's just basically lined up and said, you can't stop our run game. You know it. We know it. And we're just going to keep building everything off of that. And so that's the fear for Kansas, right? It is a similar situation because Sam Leavitt was kind of a poor man's Avery, if you will, not as good a thrower, as weird as it sounds, an effective runner, an effective scrambler, and he was able to get kind of everything he wanted in that game because of how effective Cam Scatterbo was and how effective they were up front. That's the only time, and we talked about it on the show, Nick, that's the only time this year that I think you've looked at Kansas's defensive line and said they just didn't match up today with what the other team wanted to do. They'd gotten hurt. Sluka, was a lot of scramble stuff. Altmaier hurt him a couple times on scrambles. Garrett Green was more open field type stuff. But in terms of just lining up Kansas's defensive line against the other guys in the trenches, that's really the only time I feel like this year they've quote unquote got. And Cornell Wheeler didn't play in that one. And so when you look at how important Wheeler is, especially in that between the tackles running game, I think his physicality is a big part of it. I think he sees the way run plays develop really well. We had a chance to talk to him today, and he says he feels a lot better this week. Brian Borland said today that he hasn't really been limited in practice. When they've called his name, he's gone out there and he's been 100%. And so I don't know if that means he's going to get 25 plays again like he did against Houston, or if that's the leaping off point where you say he got 25 against Houston, he's going to get 50 this week, he's going to get back up to his normal number this week. I don't know, and that's another consideration. But you're absolutely right in that if you're making a horror movie about this game from Kansas's standpoint, I think it starts with K-State just being able to line up and run DJ Giddens, because I think if they aren't able to stop DJ Giddens, it kind of renders a lot of the other stuff we're talking about moot.
Now,
Yeah.
one thing I wanted to throw in, because Kevin said nightmarish scenarios for Kansas. I think the easy thing to say here is that, a lot of the game hinges on Avery Johnson. I mean, that's the low-hanging fruit. I still think there could be a nightmare scenario if DJ Giddens gets slowed early. And I think it's the other Kansan in K-State's backfield, and that's Dylan Edwards. To me, Dylan Edwards is the one kind of nightmare guy that any team, not just Kansas, you don't want to see him get going because he opens up K-State's offense. And, for KU fans, that's been kind of a hot topic throughout much of the season, is why Dylan Edwards has not been utilized more in this offense, because whether you're giving him the ball or whether he's a decoy, he attracts a ton of attention. And so I think the more Dylan Edwards can get involved, again, whether you're giving him the ball, whether you are motioning him out as a receiver, trying to utilize him in those mismatches and say, okay, are you going to bring a safety up to guard him on the line of scrimmage and assume that he's a receiver? Are you going to bring J.B. Brown out to try and cover him? What if they motion him back into the backfield? He opens up DJ Giddens. He opens up Jace Brown and the receivers. He, to me, and I know Tim Fitzgerald at GoPowercat, that's kind of his playmaker, the kind of X factor that he's predicting for Saturday night if K-State's going to get a win, is Dylan Edwards. And I'm thinking that might be, again, DJ's a nightmare scenario, Avery's a nightmare scenario. But even if you stop both of those guys, I think in a way the guy you really don't want to get going is Dylan, because it unlocks both the pass and the run.
And if KU sends guys like we think that they might, it's pretty terrifying to think about Dylan Edwards catching a screen pass after you've just sent 6 guys and getting into the open field. But no, like I said, I think it starts, and I think Nick and I are on the same page with this one. I think it does start with DJ Giddens, just in terms of not necessarily, hey, he is the single most dangerous thing, but just sort of, if you can't stop DJ Giddens, like, a lot of the rest of this doesn't matter, because you're playing from behind at that point as a defense, because you can't stop the main thing the other team wants to do.
Yeah, I think regardless, the underlying point here is that K-State's offense feels like they're probably going to get some of theirs a little bit in this game one way or another. And flipping the page to the other side of the ball, this KU offense is probably going to have to score to match that, I would think, against the K-State defense. And look, Jalen Daniels is coming off of by far his best game of the season. Jeff Grimes has said, hey, it seems like things are starting to get figured out a little bit for the offense. It kind of showed after the bye week against Houston. And that certainly will need to continue, right? If KU wants to have success in this game. I am wondering how much KU will look to lean on Devin Neal early in a game like this, right? I mean, he's a Lawrence guy. He's a KU guy through and through. I don't think there's anybody on that field that probably is going to want to win that game more than him, based off of the fact this is his more than likely his last year for KU, and he wants to try to put a real stamp on his legacy at KU, and no better way to do it than to break the rushing record for all time and also break the streak against K-State of 15 consecutive losses. So I'm curious what his ability will be in this game, and how much KU wants to lean on him early. But when you look at this offense for Kansas, Kevin, coming off the Houston game, how confident are you that they can continue that in Manhattan against K-State?
Yeah, I think there are things to be confident about, and I know that doesn't sound the most positive thing. I think one of the things that's a little undersold with this is you think about how many vertical shots Kansas takes and the number of times that they throw the ball down the field. Ryan and I had the conversation last year, kind of all year heading into the game, that we thought that KU's biggest advantage in this game was going to be KU's wide receivers against K-State's DBs. Now, K-State's DBs, they took some lumps last year. Ryan, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, but I think that grew up after getting their lumps last year. And so it's kind of funny because I think they've played really well as a group this year. Kansas's receivers haven't had as consistent a year as you would have thought for all the football that they've played, how good they've typically been. But, Nick, they're starting to get there. And one of the reasons I talked about the vertical shots was I think everybody just kind of says, well, you're throwing a deep ball and you're not connecting. There are options on that I don't think a lot of people realize. Like, they have an option on certain plays to either streak it, take it as a post, or cut it off, depending on what the coverage shows. And so in that case, you need two things to go right. Well, you need the protection to be there as well, but you need the receiver to make the right decision based on the way he's being covered. But you also need the quarterback to make the right decision and have the right timing for what the receiver is going to do. He needs to know, okay, this is what he's going to do. And I bring all of that up as a really long way to say, I think that's where a lot of Kansas's issues were early on, that they weren't having that timing right, that they weren't making that connection. I think you saw it start to come together against Arizona State. They kind of just missed on a lot of those against TCU. And then against Houston, a lot of those vertical shots were there. I think they're going to need that against this K-State game. I think Devin Neal is a steadying force. He was unbelievable against K-State last year when they had Cole Ballard, and K-State basically knew, hey, they're giving the ball to that guy. We know it, they know it, and he still had the day that he did. But at the same time, I think if we're sitting here a week from now talking about how well the offense played, it's really going to need to be because Kansas's receivers continued to win that matchup down the field and they were able to get some shots in.
Yeah, Ryan, that's where I'm curious about the matchup that Kevin mentioned, is that how good is this K-State secondary now compared to maybe last year or even earlier this year?
How many yards did you say Devin needs to become the all-time leader?
72.
72. You know, K-State's rushing defense has been really good. And I tell you, I just respect the hell out of Devin Neal. I think he'll get there. Like, I'm to the point of just like chalk that up. Like, try as you must. But like, I think Devin Neal can get there. So like Kevin said, I mean, he'll be kind of the steadying force, and I'm just kind of expecting that he's going to get his. They might not be super dynamic runs like some of the ones he had in Lawrence last year, but like I kind of expect him to do his part in the equation. Where I was a little bit scared, if as a K-State side, right, fan, whatever in this, the guy to me that unlocks a ton for KU, particularly in this matchup, it's just a bad matchup for K-State, in my opinion. And he didn't really get a chance to get exploited last year, obviously, with Cole Ballard in. And we started to see him be that guy again, I thought, last week against Houston, is LJ Arnold. To me, LJ Arnold scares the living crap out of me as a K-State, again, fan or supporter or analyst, however you want to look at it, because, Luke Grimm, got a ton of respect for him, having covered him in high school out of Ray-Pac, an elite route runner. And to me, he's kind of like your level one guy, right? I mean, he can do a ton at like line of scrimmage to like 10 yards and then kind of can create from there, which we've seen a ton this year. Luke's been terrific. He can be a deep threat, but like, to me, that's where his bread and butter is. Quentin Skinner is your level 3 guy. He, to me, when I watch him on tape, it's like deep balls, just winning those contested catches deep downfield. LJ Arnold is kind of the Swiss Army knife. He's kind of the intermediate guy to me, that level 2, like 10 to 20 yard guy. And that is where I can remember K-State getting burned the most, not just this season, but kind of in the Chris Kleiman eras, just beyond the linebackers. And so when you get a Devin Neal going a little bit and linebackers have to honor the run, it's kind of that second level where you don't even have to go super deep, right? Like 30 plus yards, but just beyond kind of the sticks. And that's where LJ Arnold has the body that he can win over the middle there and then stretch the field too. And as Kevin mentioned, I think the cornerbacks for K-State have really grown. KU fans know the name Keenan Garber from Lawrence Free State, and he's got wheels, and he's the tallest of the corners at maybe 6 feet. That could be being generous. Jacob Parrish, too, from Olathe North, another guy that's got wheels, but he's undersized. And, they've played really well in man coverage. Zone, Nick, is where they've gotten really burned this season. And a lot of that is just miscommunication with the secondary to the cornerback or safeties to the corners, where they've given up big chunk plays because guys just aren't on the same page. I would imagine that they will try and go more man against KU. But again, Lawrence Arnold or LJ Arnold, the Quentin Skinners, those guys that can win those contested catches with their height, we saw, who was it? A.D. Mitchell at Texas won a lot of those balls against Jacob Parrish and Keenan Garber last year. I remember Quentin Johnston doing it to Jacob Parrish and Echo Boydo at times when Julius Sprints went down.
Was it Shepard that hurt K-State from Colorado?
Yes. The bigger kind of body guys can be a problem. And so to me, LJ Arnold is the one guy that you talk about, Nick, in terms of can the K-State secondary hold up? I think they can be stride for stride with him. But he, to me, is a guy that, that he can find that soft spot and really exploit it. And as we've seen, you guys especially, me just from limited research, Jalen Daniels has no qualms about throwing it into a tight window. There's some YOLO to his game, right? And, again, there could be a pick or two in this game, but I could also see him throwing one that, the KU receivers are going to go up and win that we didn't see last year because they didn't have the quarterback to do it.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the interception there because turnovers have been significant for Kansas, and it's one of the reasons why they were able to get the win against Houston, obviously, with the turnovers they created on defense, but they weren't giving it away. Jalen Daniels is obviously really struggling early in the year, and I think maybe some KU fans would say, hey, dial back the YOLO a little bit earlier in the year, and maybe KU has like 4 wins right now. But that's neither here nor there. So I think the turnovers, again, are going to be very critical. And I was going to ask you, Ryan, about what you thought maybe some of the biggest matchups were, but you kind of outlined it there. It seems like you're honed in on really the tall receivers for KU against the DBs for K-State, which I think is something that should be monitored, certainly, like you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, that to me is the one that I'm focused on in terms of, when KU has the ball. Obviously, kind of in a similar situation when K-State has the ball is, how K-State decides to play their linebackers and how much, KU and Jeff Grimes decide to utilize Jalen Daniels' wheels in this one. It sounds like maybe we won't see. Let's just play it safe and say we're not going to see 100% Daniel Highshaw, if at all. So, do you go Savion Morrison or do you say,
Nick says absolutely, you freaking
I say I pound the table. Yes, absolutely. But I will say on that point, KU has shown over the course of this year that they don't really trust any of their other running backs besides Devin Neal and Daniel Highshaw. I mean, it's the snap counts, the carries, all that. It speaks for itself. It's pretty clear, I think, at this point that KU doesn't really trust any of those other running backs, despite what I personally believe about David Morrison. Clearly, that is not. Clearly, that's not something that they believe internally. So if Daniel Highshaw is limited, I think it's just going to be Devin Neal, to be honest.
Devin Neal and Jalen Daniels.
And Jalen Daniels. And that's where if I'm K-State, and we'll find out very early in this game if KU decides to use Jalen early in terms of a rusher, is, do they honor him as again, fresh off what Garrett Green did to K-State in the first half? Because that game could have gone a much different way in the second half if Garrett Green doesn't get injured. He was really torching them on scrambles. Do they look at Jalen Daniels and say, knowing what we just saw against Garrett Green, we got to spy somebody here? Or, do they let their linebackers play a little bit more freely? That is a matchup I'm curious about. And then, Kevin, for me, the other one, when K-State has the ball that I haven't touched on yet, is who does KU decide and how do they decide to defend the K-State tight ends?
Yep.
Tight ends are, a bread and butter. It's a staple of K-State for going back to Coach Snyder, but it's heavy in the game plan week to week, again, with Connor Riley and Matt Wells. They've got a number of different guys that they can use there. Garrett Oakley's been the number one starter, and he's kind of been more of the pass-catching specialist, if you will. You've got Will Swanson, who's the senior, thought to be more the blocking type, but they've gotten him more involved as a receiver. And then they had Braden Lofton. He got injured, and now they've gone to a Kansan and Will Ancio from Wichita, Cape, and Mount Carmel. And he's been really developing as a blocker, but you've seen over the course of, what was it, the BYU game, and then again in West Virginia, he got 2 touchdown passes in the red zone where they kind of leaked him out in a seam, and he was wide open. So he's showing that he can be a pass catcher as well. Kevin, does KU honor tight ends? Have they shown that ability this year? And if so, who are you putting on K-State's tight ends in those coverage situations?
Well, they haven't gone up against a lot of great tight ends, and yet they've still been vulnerable, I think, in the passing game across the middle of the field. And it's a good question to ask because I think you look at last year's KU-K-State game, and KU struggled to defend Jace Brown down the field. And so I would expect that Jace would draw maybe even a little extra attention this time. I don't think he's going to sneak up on Kansas this time. It doesn't mean he's not going to have a good day. I just mean that I think they're going to go into it, with more eyes on him. And I think that does really open up sort of a death by 10,000 paper cuts type scenario with that tight end position where K-State is able to, on 3rd and 7, find Garrett Oakley for 10. When they're in the red zone, being able to find Will Ancio on, 2nd and goal from the 6. I think it's a really fair question. I think that's the other part where you wonder a little bit with the pressure is, Nick, would you say, J.B. Brown might be your best choice for chasing guys around just because of his athleticism, but then you're losing J.B. Brown's ability to rush the passer, his ability to spy when you're having that. And so that is a really fair question about how Kansas is going to match up there.
Yeah. And I think when you talk matchups, the ones you guys mentioned as well, the other one that I'm keeping an eye on, Kobe Bryant against Jace Brown. You brought it up, Kevin. I think that's going to be a matchup we're going to see regularly on Saturday night. And I don't really think there's very much love lost between those two guys either. So I think that is one that could be in for some fireworks potentially between those two players. And again, I think kind of going back to the discussion of how Kansas may try to stop K-State, like if Kobe Bryant's able to sort of win that matchup more often than not, especially down the field, that would be very huge for KU overall in this game. I would be very remiss if I did not mention the third element of the game, which is the special teams. Lance Leipold actually talked about this earlier in the week. You look at the past 2 games in 2022 and last year for Kansas, there's 2 pretty obvious, well, actually 3 really obvious special teams plays that really sunk Kansas. You go back to the muff punt they had to start the game in 2022 after a 3-and-out that really kind of set the tone for the rest of the game. Then last year you have a muff punt by Trevor Wilson. You go back even earlier, you had the blocked extra point that was ran back by K-State as well. So special teams has played a significant impact over the course of this win streak for Kansas State. So I would just be remiss without mentioning that as well as something to keep an eye on in terms of, having a potentially big play happen in that area.
Yeah, I think, with Kansas in particular, if this is a close game, you almost have 2 things working against you, right? You have the history of the series where Kansas sort of seems to have the big moment in a bad way in a really big time. And I think you look at how much Kansas has struggled in close games this season. And that's not to say that this can't be the game where they put some of those demons to bed on both of them. But it is something that you think is certainly going to be in the back of Kansas fans' minds, and you wonder a little bit if it's something that players are going to consider at least a little bit, sort of hey, we had them last year and we made those mistakes. I'm glad you brought up the blocked extra point that was run back, because I'm not sure a lot of people sort of place the significance of that in last year's game. If KU makes that extra point, which again doesn't sound like a bigger deal, on KU's final drive where Cole Ballard winds up throwing up a 4th down pass into the end zone, KU's kicking a field goal, tie, I believe, or either the tie or the lead at that point. So it wound up being a huge play that mattered at the very end. And obviously the 2 muffs that you're talking about, if Kansas is going to win this game, and it's not going to be easy, it's going to need to be a pretty clean game. And I mean that from a turnover standpoint. I mean that from a not really making big mistakes standpoint. And I also just mean from a do your job and don't worry what the guy next to you is doing type of standpoint. If they got guys out there trying to play hero ball, it's probably not going to work. And that's the thing that's frustrating about playing Kansas State first under Bill Snyder and now under Chris Kleiman is Kansas State does not beat itself. It just doesn't. That's why the BYU game was so fluky, was Kansas State did kind of beat itself with some really fluky plays in that one. But generally speaking, if you beat K-State, it's because you have to beat K-State. And so number one thing that Kansas cannot afford to do in this one is beat itself and do K-State's job for it.
My only thoughts on special teams is I kind of have a theory. and part of it is, as you guys have mentioned, I think K-State's really put an emphasis on special teams going, through the Snyder years, right? So it's always had maybe more of an emphasis than your average program. But I think particularly when it comes to the Sunflower Showdown, K-State has, I'm not going to beat a dead horse. There's way more Kansans on K-State's roster than KU's roster. We all know that, right? Like
sure.
Everybody understands that. But in a lot of times, even though there are a lot of Kansans on the 1 and 2 deeps on offense and defense, where you really get a lot of those guys on the field, and it might be their only times on the field in terms of native Kansans, has been on special teams. It's like littered with Kansas guys across the board. Oftentimes, like I said, a lot of preferred walk-on type guys that otherwise don't really see the field on offense or defense. And so because of that, they're balls to the wall out there on special teams. You've got a guy like Ty Bowman from Chanute that, like, this is what he's going to live for, the ability to make a play on special teams. And, when you talk about special teams in this particular game on Saturday, guys, I found one element that was like alarming to me and could be a beneficiary to K-State. KU is bottom of the barrel in net punting, like 35 yards a punt.
After last year, by the way, where KU actually allowed -6 yards on punt returns for the entire season. Yeah, so they were number 1 in the Big 12 in net punting a year ago, but they've given up some just huge returns at moments this year.
And that's where I go back to, the guy that I brought up earlier, which is, we saw Dylan Edwards do it in a primetime matchup at home a couple weeks ago against Arizona. That could be another X factor, as Nick talked about, in terms of, I think, kickoff coverage. KU's been really solid, and K-State hasn't been kind of as good in kick returns as we've seen in the past. But I will be highly, invested when KU's out there punting to Dylan Edwards to see how those possessions go.
All right, fellas, I think it's time to make some game picks here. We talked about the matchups across the board, offense, defense, and special teams as well. Some good analysis there in terms of, Dylan Edwards on special teams is also a very scary thing to think about. And by the way, we're coming up on Halloween, so it's the whole thing is kind of coming full circle here with the scary nightmares theme. But yeah, it's a night game in Manhattan. Of course, the streak is at 15 at this point. Kansas going into a very difficult environment. Start with Kevin. Kevin, do you think KU can go in and possibly pull this one off?
I think they can. It's going to be tough, though. I think K-State, you brought this up on the show, Nick. You brought this up in casual conversation with Ryan and I as well. Kansas State's really good at home, and that adds an extra element to this. And that if this game were in Lawrence, I think I might even have slightly different feelings. The version that we saw of KU against Houston wasn't perfect. There were still some mistakes out there that, hey, if that's a better team, maybe Kansas gets hurt a little more in those situations. I don't want to take anything away from it. Houston's got a pretty good secondary. They had been really good against the pass, and Jalen Daniels had a really good day. They did a lot of really positive things. I think Kansas keeps this one close. I really do. And I think Kansas State probably wins by about a touchdown. But I will say that there may be a chance for Kansas in this one to kind of make the play that it hasn't made in the previous 15 years. And whether or not it's able to make that play, could tell the tale on this one. After 15 years, it's kind of hard to say that play is going to happen. Fran Fraschilla talks all the time about how if you want to beat Kansas and Allen Fieldhouse, you really got to be 10 points better on that given night than KU is. Because if you're just 3 points better, they're probably going to find a way to win, and or you're going to find a way to lose because of that. I tend to think this is one of those situations where for Kansas to win this game, I'm not saying it has to win by 14, but it may have to be 14 points better than Kansas State or looking like they're 14 points better than Kansas State to get across the finish line, and I'm not sure I see them being there.
It's funny that you bring up basketball because I went there a little bit in my mind this week of it's not that dissimilar from K-State struggles with Kansas on the hardwood. And so I've thought, like, when K-State has, going back to whatever year that was with Drummond DR and Skylar Thomas, the last time they won in Allen Fieldhouse, like, you either have to have stuff just somehow go your way, right? Like BYU fluky, or you needed the Michael Beasley to end a streak, right? You need like somebody to just go nuts and be that elite superhuman force for that one night. And so again, I will say I think KU has the pieces where maybe you don't need the Michael Beasley effort from one specific player. Maybe you just need a couple guys to have kind of career nights, or K-State have an off night. But I still I'm with you, Kevin. I think this game is going to be probably more competitive than K-State fans want it to be. And it's going to keep fans kind of on the edge of their seat a little bit longer than they'd like to be in this game. Because to me, and I'll go back to my very first response 53 minutes ago on this show, which is, in a weird way, I think if things had gone the way I thought they would, again, saying that KU had kind of cruised to this stage and they were the power, the higher ranked team, that it almost puts more pressure on the Jayhawks in a way. And I think right now KU's playing with house money. I think that there's probably, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, there's probably a section of the fan base that's kind of already moved on, kind of written this season off. And yet you've got a lot of guys that are like, that played a lot of minutes, that played in this Sunflower Showdown more than most of the guys on K-State's team have. And I think they know that they've, again, been in these experiences. They know what they're getting into. And it's, what do we have to lose? Like another game in this series? Let's go out there and just let it fly. And that makes me incredibly nervous. And so I'm with you, Kevin. I mean, I'm not going to put a score on it. I will say I found a weird stat that I'll throw out on this show as well, that over the 121 years of this rivalry, never has a team reached the 30-point mark and still lost. So KU's hit 27 both the last 2 years, but again, losing efforts. Only 4 times over the past 30 meetings has the eventual winner failed to score at least 30 points. So, I mean, yeah, there have been, a couple 16-10s in there or whatever, but I mean, I will say it seems like the team that's going to hit 30 is going to win. So, if I had to put like a number on it, I lean K-State, but it might be like 34-27, 33-30 kind of situation. So I'm with Kevin on this one, Nick. I think it's going to make K-State fans get a little uneasy heading into maybe the fourth quarter.
There is no question in my mind that over the past couple of years, KU has closed the talent gap with Kansas State. No question in my mind. The question, though, still remains, has Kansas closed the mental gap?
Yep.
And heading into this game in Manhattan, that is going to be really put to the test, because this season has already tested Kansas mentally a lot more than probably they expected to be, with some of the close games that they've lost and the start that they had to the season. And this is kind of the make or break game of the season for KU, right? Like, we talked about it after the Houston game, Kevin, on this show, but like, was Houston just a blip in the radar of what becomes a 3-9 disappointing season? Or was it truly the spark of something greater for Kansas and they can turn this thing around? We're going to find out 1 week later against Kansas State. Like that question will be answered on Saturday night of whether or not the rest of the season, how it's going to be for KU. So that's kind of my thought. Is there's no doubt in my mind that Kansas has the horses in this game. There's no doubt that they have the talent to stand toe to toe with Kansas State in Manhattan, but it's that mental aspect, the streak on the road, all of that, everything. I mean, all of the history of things that have gone wrong for Kansas in games where they probably should have won last year. I think back to like 2018, another game that Kansas probably could have won. They had another one in there as well. So it's just that aspect of it. Can KU overcome that and win this game on the road in Manhattan? I'm to the point now, and I was like this for a long time with KU when they really struggled through the 2010s, especially on the road in conference play. You didn't win a conference game in 10 years. So on the road. So for me, on the road, it's hard for me to say, okay, this is the one where I'm just going to pick against them until they prove me wrong. So as much as it pains me to say, I don't really know that KU is going to be able to pull this one out. I mean, K-State's been really, really good at home. They're playing at a high level. Avery Johnson is so dynamic. Like, I guess it'll just come down to the offense for Kansas. They're able to keep up. Maybe if Devin Neal can have a Herculean effort type of night. But even then, I don't know if that's going to be enough. So I'm going to have to go against KU on this one as well, as much as I don't want to. But that's kind of where I'm at on this one. I think maybe it's like 38-28, maybe K-State will win it. But yeah, I'm feeling a little better now. I'm feeling a little better now than I was earlier in the week.
There you go.
Earlier in the week, I was at the edge of the cliff. I've come back and kind of and not to the point where I think they're going to win, but
small cross promotion opportunity here for UKU fans. If the streak is snapped, you will want to tune in to Verbal Commitment right here on KCSN next week, because the screenshots will be ready with me and with me donning a KU hat. So come back next week, not just for the Pay Eid show here, but for Verbal Commitment, because the photos and screenshots of that I will probably never live down for the rest of my life. So,
and I would say be sure to check out Verbal Commit this week. There was some great conversation with Kevin and Ryan about the recruiting aspect of the Sunflower Showdown, about the in-state recruits and all that stuff. So be sure to check that out as well. But Ryan, appreciate your time so much for coming on here to help us break down this game against K-State. And yeah, of course, be sure to keep an eye out on Saturday night for Kevin and I with our instant reaction to this game in Manhattan against Kansas State on our YouTube channel at Kansas Jayhawks KCSN, and also on the audio platform as well. You can also follow along on our social medias at Paid KCSN is our podcast account. You can follow us individually at K Flaherty KCSN and at Nick Springer 29. Until then, hang out of your hats, buckle up, and let's just try to have some fun. It's a rivalry game, I know, so tensions are going to be high. Let's just try to have some fun, like we always do. So until then, we will talk to you again soon. See ya.